The county auctioneer called the lot twice before anyone answered. An abandoned schoolhouse on Route 7, outside a hollow. Most maps had stopped naming, sitting on a quarter-acre of overgrown sumac and cracked foundation stone. No plumbing that worked. No heat source built after 1962. 2 of the 6 windows boarded. The opening bid was $5, and for a long moment, not a single hand went up. Then Nora Aldwell raised hers. She was 23 years old. Her sister Claire stood beside her with $41 between them and a half-empty toolbox in the bed of a borrowed truck. They had grown up in this county and left it in a caseworker's sedan at 16, the week after their mother died, with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and the particular silence of people who have learned not to ask for things. Nobody had given them much since. Nobody had thought to. The schoolhouse had not held a student in 31 years. The porch listed hard to the left. A family of raccoons had established something resembling a dynasty in the attic. Whatever the building had once meant to the people of Aldermore Hollow, it had long since faded into the kind of forgetting that a county deed office records in a single dry line. Tax lien, uncontested, open auction. $5. Sold. But there was one thing on that property that did not match the decay around it. One thing that suggested someone had been there not long ago, or had planned, very deliberately, for someone else to arrive. On the cellar door, beneath a tangle of wild grape and rust-stained hardware, sat a padlock that had been oiled within the last season. Clean. Snug in the hasp. Waiting. What Nora and Claire Aldwell found on the other side of that door would not make the local paper. It would not trend anywhere or reach anyone who was not standing in that cellar, breathing cold stone air, holding a lantern in 2 hands. But it would change the rest of their lives. And it would speak, in the handwriting of a woman 30 years dead, directly to every person who had ever needed a place to begin again. The morning of the auction was cold for April. A thin frost had settled on the courthouse steps overnight, and by 9 o'clock it had not entirely lifted. Nora Aldwell sat in the 3rd row of folding chairs with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before she finished half of it. Claire sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching, reading nothing from a folded county notice she had already read 4 times. Neither of them spoke much. They had not spoken much since they were 16, not to each other about things that mattered, not in the way that required words. The auction was held in the side room of the Aldermore County Administrative Building, a low cinder block addition that smelled of carpet adhesive and old paper. 12 people had come. Most were men in their 50s and 60s, contractors and speculators who knew which properties carried real upside and which were money pits dressed in old wood. They had clipboards. They had phones. They glanced at Nora and Claire once and did not glance again. The sisters did not have clipboards. They had the folded notice, the paper cup, and $41 in a combination of bills and quarters that Claire had counted twice in the truck. The auctioneer moved through the morning list with the flat efficiency of a man who had done this every 3rd Tuesday for 19 years. A parcel on County Road 412. A condemned duplex on the south edge of Harnett. A half-acre of landlocked timber nobody could access without crossing a neighbor's field. The contractors raised their paddles at a steady rhythm, and the numbers climbed in increments, and Nora watched and waited and kept her hands still in her lap. She had learned to keep her hands still a long time ago. Lot 17 was the schoolhouse on Route 7. The auctioneer read the address from his sheet without inflection and set the opening bid at $5 because the county assessor had noted structural deficiencies, no functioning utilities, and an outstanding tax burden of $2,312 that would transfer to the buyer at closing. A murmur moved through the row of contractors. One man in a canvas coat shook his head and wrote something on his clipboard. Another leaned to the man beside him and said something Nora could not hear. Nobody raised a paddle. The room sat quiet for 3 full seconds, which is a long time in an auction room. Then Nora raised her hand. She paid $5 at the clerk's window in the hallway. The clerk slid the deed across the counter in a brown envelope without looking up. Nora took it. She held it flat against her sternum for a moment while Claire waited beside her, and then she opened the envelope and pulled the deed out an inch to check the address printed on it. Route 7, Aldermore Hollow Township. She had seen that address once before. She had been 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on a kitchen linoleum floor while her mother sorted mail, and her mother had held an envelope just like this one and said a name, Delia Marsh. Then she had set it aside and said nothing else. Nora had never asked. You learned early in that house not to press on things that made her mother go quiet. They drove north on Route 7 in Claire's borrowed truck, a 1993 Ford Ranger with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only on the highest setting. The road was familiar in the way that childhood landscapes are familiar, not remembered exactly, but recognized in the body before the mind catches up. Nora had not been this far up Route 7 since she was 14. The farms thinned out past the grain elevator and the tree line pressed in from both sides, and the road shed its center line somewhere around the 4-mile marker and became the kind of road that asks you to slow down whether you mean to or not. Claire drove. Nora held the deed in her lap and looked out the window at the fields going by. Dead corn stalks not yet turned under, a collapsed tobacco barn silver with age, a farmhouse with its windows intact but no sign of a vehicle in the drive. The county had its pockets of stillness. It always had. Their mother had grown up 12 miles from here and had spoken of it rarely and fondly. And then, in her last years, not at all. The girls had grown up in the county seat, which was different, busier, louder, with a dollar store and a laundromat and a school district that moved children through its grades with institutional patience and no particular tenderness. When their mother died on a February morning 7 years earlier, Nora had been 16 and Claire had just turned 15. There was no father in the picture, had not been for years. There were no aunts or uncles who answered their phones. The county caseworker was a tired woman named Sandra Hoops, who arrived with 2 forms and a clear plastic bag, and who drove them to a group home in a town 40 minutes south with a gentleness that was real, but also final. They stayed in that system until they aged out of it. They had been, in the technical language of the county, wards. In the plain language of the thing, they had been alone. Nora had worked in a paper goods warehouse since she was 18, pulling orders from rolling steel shelves 8 hours a day. Claire worked the early shift at a diner called the Hollow Fork, where she made $4.85 an hour, plus tips that averaged $11 on a good morning. Between them, they rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a vacuum repair shop on Clement Street, and between them they had managed, for 5 years, to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked and their 2 names on a lease. It was not nothing. It was also not enough to feel like solid ground. The schoolhouse appeared through the tree line before the road bent to show it fully. Nora saw the roof line first, cedar shingles gone gray, the ridge slightly bowed in the middle where a rafter had probably cracked under ice load. Then the building itself came into view. White clapboard siding, gone to chalk, 6/6 windows, of which 2 were boarded with OSB that had weathered to the color of cardboard. A porch across the front with 1 step collapsed at the left end. The yard around it was sumac and wild grape and a stand of young birch that had come up along the foundation and would be working at the mortar by now. The whole thing sat heavy and still under the gray April sky, the way things sit when they have been waiting a long time and have grown patient with it. Claire pulled the truck off the road onto a flat patch of gravel that might once have been a parking area and shut the engine off. They sat for a moment. A crow called once from the birch stand and went quiet. Nora looked at the building through the windshield, and then she looked down at the cellar door, set into the ground at the left side of the foundation, half hidden by the grapevine. The hasp was rusted. The hinges were rusted, but the padlock seated in the hasp was clean. The shackle showed no oxidation. Someone had oiled it within the last season, maybe less. Nora looked at it for a long moment and said nothing. Claire saw it too. Neither of them mentioned it. They got out of the truck and walked toward the front door, and the gravel crunched under their boots. And the crow did not call again. They had brought what they could fit in the bed of the Ranger without it shifting on the road. A Stanley Fat Max toolbox, 22 inches, with a broken latch they had fixed with a bungee cord. 2 pry bars, a short one and a long one. A cordless drill with 2 batteries, both of them old enough that neither held a full charge anymore. A coil of orange extension cord, 50 feet, the kind sold at hardware clearance bins at the end of summer. A flashlight and a headlamp. 2 sleeping bags rolled tight, a camp stove, and a bag of groceries from the Food King on Clement Street that had cost them $34 and included a box of oatmeal, a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and 6 cans of soup. They were not planning to stay, but they brought what you bring when you are not entirely sure. Nora had driven the first leg from the county building back to the apartment, where they spent 40 minutes loading the truck in silence. Claire had made 2 sandwiches and wrapped them in wax paper and set them on the seat between them without comment. Nora ate hers before they reached the edge of town. Claire ate half of hers and folded the wax paper back over the rest with the neat, economical habit of someone who had learned not to waste the second half of anything. The truck cab smelled of coffee and sawdust and the faint petroleum note of old upholstery warming in the thin April sun. The heater ran on high, as it always did. The radio antenna had snapped off 2 winters ago, so they drove in quiet. The county road north of town was 2 lanes of patched asphalt that the township resurfaced in sections, so the ride alternated between smooth and corrugated, the truck shuddering over frost-heaved seams before settling again. Nora watched the landscape open and flatten and then begin to fold back into itself as the elevation climbed past the grain elevator and the last of the farm supply lots. She knew this road the way you know something you encountered in childhood before you had words for it. In the body, not in the mind. The ridge to the east. The way the light hit the standing water in the low fields. The particular gray of a sky that was not going to rain but was not going to clear either. She had ridden this road in the back seat of her mother's Buick a handful of times, going nowhere she could now name. Past the 4-mile marker, the pavement gave way to gravel without ceremony. No sign, no change in grade. Just the sound shifting under the tires from a low hiss to a steady crunch, and the steering going slightly loose in Nora's hands as the wheels found less resistance. Claire reached up and steadied herself on the grab handle above the door. The gravel was county maintained up to a point, and then it wasn't, and you could tell where the maintenance ended by the way the road narrowed and the crown flattened and the drainage ditches filled in with sedge grass and old leaf matter. Sumac pressed in from both sides, the branches still bare but thick enough to cut the sight lines, so the road showed itself only 20 yards at a time. It asked you to slow down. Nora slowed down. The toolbox shifted once on a bad rut, and Nora heard the pry bars clank against the drill case and then settle. She watched the rear view. Nothing had fallen. The road bent left around a stand of mature oaks whose roots had begun to buckle the gravel at the shoulder, and then it straightened again and dropped slightly toward a low creek crossing. 2 concrete culvert pipes under a flat gravel deck that the county had poured sometime in the 70s and not touched since. The truck crossed it with a hollow sound, like a drumbeat, and then climbed back out on the far side, and the road narrowed again to barely a lane and a half, the sumac branches close enough on Claire's side that a few of them dragged across the passenger mirror. Claire did not flinch. She was watching the tree line ahead. The schoolhouse came into view the way things come into view on roads like that one. Not all at once, but in pieces. First, the roof line above the tree line, the ridge of it against the sky, bowed slightly in the middle the way a spine bows under long years of uneven weight. Then the upper half of the clapboard siding, gone from white to the color of old bone, the paint not peeling so much as simply exhausted, lying flat against the wood in translucent flakes. Then the full face of the building as the road opened into what had once been a cleared yard and was now a tangle of sumac seedlings and wild grape and a volunteer stand of white birch saplings that had come up along the south foundation wall and were now 8 feet tall, their roots certainly working at the mortar between the stones. The porch ran the full width of the front. The left end had lost its middle step, which had dropped and split. The two halves angled down into the gap like an open book. The right end of the porch was intact. The front door was shut and appeared to be in its frame. Claire pulled the truck off onto the flat gravel apron, what had been once a small parking area, the gravel still distinct underfoot though grass had taken the edges, and cut the engine. The silence after the engine stopped was immediate and full. No traffic sound, no machinery. A wind moved through the birch saplings along the foundation, and they bent together and straightened. A crow called once from the oak stand up the road and did not call again. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the building through the windshield for a long moment. 5 windows visible from the front, plus the 2 boarded ones on the east end. A chimney in the center of the roof line, the capstone cracked and tilted but still seated. A length of stovepipe that had once connected to something, and now connected to nothing. Rusted through at the collar and hanging by one bracket. She looked at the cellar door again. It was set into the ground at the left side of the foundation, maybe 8 feet from the corner. A pair of angled wooden doors over a concrete surround. The standard design for a root cellar or a coal chute or a storm shelter. The kind of thing built into every farmhouse and rural schoolhouse in this part of the county from about 1920 through 1950. The hinges were surface-mounted steel, and they had rusted to a uniform brown that matched the rest of the hardware on the building. The wooden doors themselves had checked and split along the grain in the way wood does when it cycles through many winters with no paint to protect it. The grapevine had grown across the left door and died and grown again, and the dead tendrils lay across the wood in a gray lattice. But the hasp was clean. The padlock seated in it was a laminated steel body lock, a brand Nora recognized from the hardware aisle at Braddock's, and it showed no rust on the shackle and no weathering on the body. Someone had put it there recently. Someone had wanted that door to stay closed. They got out of the truck. The gravel crunched under their boots. The air smelled of wet earth and the faint green bitterness of sumac sap warming in the afternoon. Nora pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the front porch without speaking, stepping over the dropped section of the left porch step and testing the right side with her boot before putting her weight on it. It held. The boards were soft, but not gone. Claire came up beside her and they stood in front of the door together. The knob was a glass hexagonal knob, the kind that had been common from the 1920s through the 40s, and it turned in Nora's hand with some resistance, and then with a soft giving sensation, and the door opened inward into the dark of the schoolhouse and the smell of cold plaster and mouse and old pine and something else underneath it. Something that was not decay exactly, but the particular stillness of a room that has been sealed a long time and has kept its own air. They stood in the doorway and looked in. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Nora stepped inside, and Claire followed, and the floorboards spoke under their weight, and the sound of the wind outside fell away behind the door. The main room ran the full width of the building, maybe 30 feet across and 20 deep, with the ceiling at 10 feet and a row of 3 windows on the north wall that let in the flat gray afternoon light in long, pale rectangles across the floor. The floor was wide plank pine, 1.5 inch boards, face nailed with cut nails that had bled rust stains down the grain over the decades. Some boards had cupped. 2 near the east wall had buckled entirely, their edges riding up over each other at the seam. And when Nora stepped on one, it gave softly under her boot in a way that meant the joist below it had taken water at some point and not recovered. She stepped back and made a mental note and moved on. You learned to move on from soft spots until you had the full picture. Claire walked the perimeter while Nora worked the center. This was how they had always divided a space, not by agreement, not by instruction, but by the habit of 2 people who had shared close quarters long enough to develop a kind of spatial grammar between them. Claire ran her hand along the plaster walls, pressing at intervals, listening for the hollow sound that meant the lath had separated behind it. She found 3 sections on the south wall that had gone hollow, one of them large enough that when she pressed with her palm, the plaster flexed visibly. The baseboard along the east wall had pulled away from the floor in a long section, and behind it she could see the gray fluff of mouse insulation and the dark pellets that confirmed the raccoon family the roof had been sheltering was not the only wildlife in residence. She did not comment on any of this. She catalogued it in her head and kept moving. The chimney was central, a masonry box 4 feet square at the base, built of handmade brick and a lime mortar that had been good work once and was now crumbling at the joints above the firebox opening. The firebox itself was deep and clean. Someone had swept it at some point, or it had simply been long enough since the last fire that the ash had settled to a dust and blown away. The damper handle was a cast iron lever, and when Nora tried it, it moved the first 1/4 inch and then seized. She did not force it. Above the firebox, the chimney narrowed to a flue liner, and she could see daylight at the top, which was either a sign the flue was clear or a sign the cap had failed and the liner had cracked. Both were possible. Only a camera on a flexible rod would tell her which, and she did not have one. The oil furnace occupied the northeast corner of the room, a Sears Roebuck unit from 1962, the model name stenciled on the side panel in letters that had faded to near illegibility, Comfort King. It was a floor-standing unit with a gravity feed and a flue collar on the top that had once connected to the chimney by a length of black stovepipe. But the stovepipe had been removed at some point, leaving the collar open to the room. The fuel line running from the furnace to the exterior tank had been capped at the wall, properly capped, with a brass fitting and thread sealant, not just bent over. Someone had shut this building down with some care. That detail registered with Nora the same way the padlock had. Not neglect. Intention. They found the grade book on the second morning. Nora had pulled up the buckled floorboards near the east wall to assess the joist below. It was a doubled 2x8, rough sawn, probably original to the building, and it had taken water damage at the bearing end where it sat on the sill plate, the bottom 2 inches soft with rot while the rest of the joist remained sound. She was working with a pry bar, the short one, levering the nails out of the face of a soundboard adjacent to the damaged section, when the board came up and something slid out from the gap beneath it onto the subfloor. A book. Narrow, cloth-bound, the cover a faded burgundy, the spine reading in stamped gold letters that had mostly flaked away. Grade record. She picked it up and opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was precise and small, in blue-black ink that had browned at the edges. Aldermore Hollow District School, primary class. September 1947. Below that, a list of names in 2 columns. 31 names, children who had sat in this room 79 years ago and learned to read and cipher and raise their hands before speaking. Claire came and looked at it over her shoulder. Neither of them said much. Claire turned a few pages, attendance marks, test scores rendered as fractions, a note in the margin beside one name that read simply, "Needs spectacles. Inform family." The handwriting was the same throughout, steady and without flourish, the handwriting of someone who wrote a great deal and had long since stopped thinking about the act of writing itself. At the back of the book, in the same hand, a single line on the inside back cover. D. Marsh, teacher, 1947 to 1978. Nora looked at the name for a moment. Then she set the book carefully on the windowsill, in the light, and went back to the joist. By the end of the second day, they had a full damage inventory in Nora's notebook, a spiral-bound pocket notebook she kept in her jacket. Soft joist at the east-bearing wall. Sistering required. 2 lengths of 2x8, pressure-treated at the bearing end. 3 sections of failed plaster on the south wall, likely lath separation, full removal and drywall replacement. Chimney damper seized, flue condition unknown, furnace non-operational and beyond economic repair, remove and dispose. 2 boarded windows, glass intact behind the OSB on one, broken on the other, single pane original glass 6/6 replacement to match. Porch step collapsed, stringers likely sound, treads only. Roof. Visible sag at the ridge suggesting a failed rafter, sister, a replace not yet assessed from inside the attic. The attic access was a hatch in the ceiling of what had been a small anteroom off the main space, and when Nora pushed it open with the end of the long pry bar, a quantity of dry insulation, and what appeared to be a dismantled bird's nest, fell through onto the floor. She let the dust settle, and then climbed up on the 3-step folding stool they had brought, and put her head through the hatch with the headlamp on. The attic was low and dim and smelled of pine resin and something animal and old. The rafters were 2x6, rough sawn, set at 24 inches on center. One rafter on the south side had cracked at mid-span and been pushed down by the weight of the cedar shingles above it until the ridgeboard above had deflected perhaps 3 inches from level. The sheathing boards above the failed rafter had a dark stain. Old water intrusion, not active. The wood dry now and stable. The raccoon situation had resolved itself at some point, the evidence present but old. Nora looked at the cracked rafter for a long time in the beam of the headlamp, measuring in her head. She had sistered rafters before, in a job she had held for 8 months at a renovation company when she was 20, before the company lost a contract and let its 3 newest hires go. She knew the geometry. She came back down through the hatch and wrote one more line in her notebook. That night they ate soup, heated on the camp stove, and sat on their sleeping bags against the south wall with the flashlight set upright on the floor between them, its beam diffusing against the ceiling into a pale ambient glow. The gradebook sat on the windowsill where Nora had left it. Outside, the wind had picked up after dark and was moving through the birch saplings, along the foundation in a low, continuous sound that was not quite a whisper and not quite anything else. Claire said she thought the bones of the building were good. Nora said she thought so too. They finished their soup and rinsed the cups with water from the gallon jug they had brought and set them upside down to dry on the toolbox, and then they turned off the flashlight and lay in their sleeping bags in the full dark of the schoolhouse, listening to the birch saplings move outside, and the building settled once around them with a low creak, and then went quiet. Tuesday morning, Nora drove back down Route 7 alone. Claire stayed at the schoolhouse to continue pulling the failed plaster from the south wall, a job that required more patience than skill, and produced a quantity of dust that settled on every horizontal surface within 20 feet. Nora had the short list in her jacket pocket, written in the same spiral notebook. 2 lengths of 2x8, pressure-treated 10-foot, a box of 3-inch structural screws, 4 joist hanger brackets, the double shear type, a tube of hydraulic cement for the foundation crack she had found at the northeast corner, and a bag of Type S mortar mix for the chimney joints. She also needed lag screws, 3/8 by 4-inch, a box of 50. For the rafter sister she had not yet started, but was already building in her head. The list came to what she estimated was $60 or $70, and she had $83 in her wallet, which left a margin that was real but not comfortable. Braddock's Feed and Hardware sat on the north end of Aldermore Hollow's main street, which was 4 blocks long and contained a diner, a post office, a farm insurance office, a barber shop that appeared to be open on alternating Thursdays, and Braddock's. The hardware store occupied a building that had been a livery stable in an earlier life, and the high ceiling and wide board floors still suggested horses more than merchandise, though the walls were hung with the standard inventory of a working farm country hardware store: coils of rope and chain, pegboard panels of drill bits and driver sets, a rack of work gloves in graduated sizes, a shelf of caulk and adhesives and waterproofing compounds arranged with the pragmatic disorder of a place where things get pulled and replaced daily by people who know where they are. A hand-lettered sign above the register read, "If we don't have it, you probably don't need it." Nora had been in the store twice before, years ago, on errands for the renovation company. It looked the same. The man behind the counter was Earl Braddock. She knew this because his name was on the building and because he had the settled, unhurried quality of someone who has been in the same place long enough that the place has arranged itself around him. He was in his 70s, broad through the shoulders but carrying that breadth lightly, with white hair cut short and hands that rested on the counter the way tools rest in a drawer. Still, but ready. He was writing something in a ledger when Nora came in. He finished the line he was writing before he looked up. He said good morning, and she said good morning, and she handed him the list without preamble because that was the kind of store where you handed a person your list. He read it without comment, moving his lips slightly on the structural screws item, which she had abbreviated in a way that might have been ambiguous. He asked if she meant the structural rated exterior screws or the deck screws. She said structural rated. He nodded and came around the counter and led her to the lumber rack at the back of the store, where the 2x8s were standing upright in a bin. He pulled 2 lengths and set them on the rack's sorting ledge and sighted down them the way you sight down a board to check for crown. One eye closed, the board at arm's length. He set one back and pulled another. He did not explain this. He did not need to. Nora watched and understood that he was giving her straight stock, which was a small courtesy that would matter when she was trying to get the sister tight against the existing rafter. At the joist hanger section, he asked without looking at her what she was working on. She told him, "The old schoolhouse on Route 7, up past the creek crossing." He was quiet for a moment. He took the double shear hangers from the bin, counted out 4, and set them in the small carry basket he had handed her at the door. Then he said he had not heard that place had sold. She told him it had come up at the county tax auction. He said the county had been trying to move that property for some years. She said she knew. He did not ask what she paid. She did not tell him. There was a brief, comfortable silence of the kind that settles between people who are both accustomed to not saying the obvious thing. She found the hydraulic cement and the mortar mix herself on the masonry aisle and set them in the basket. At the register, he rang the items through a mechanical adding machine, the kind with a paper tape, and the total came to $61.40. She paid with 3/20s and received change, and put the change in her jacket pocket. She was picking up the bag of mortar mix when Earl Braddock said, without any particular emphasis, that she would want a 12-foot pry bar for the rafter work. She looked at him. He said the short bar was fine for flooring, but when you were working overhead and needed to drive a sister tight against a bowed rafter without losing your footing on the ceiling joists, the long handle gave you the leverage to do it from a stable position. She said she had a long bar. He said he knew the kind sold at clearance bins and asked if it was 36 inches or 48. She said 36. He went to the back of the store without asking her anything further and came back with a 48-inch Estwing pry bar, the blue vinyl grip, and set it on the counter. She said, "What do I owe you?" He said nothing. It was a loaner. She could bring it back when she was done with it. She said that might be a while. He said that was fine. He had 2 others. She picked up the bar, and it was heavier than her 36-inch and balanced differently. The weight distributed further from the hand, and she could already feel how it would change the work. She said, "Thank you." He nodded. She was at the door when he said, still at the register, not looking up from the ledger he had returned to. That property belonged to Delia Marsh for 40 years. She stopped. She turned. He said Delia had been the school teacher there from 47 to 78 and had bought the land and building from the district when they closed the school. He said she had lived there alone for a long time after. He said she had been a particular kind of woman, the kind that did things without making a point of doing them. He said this last part to the ledger, not to Nora, and then he wrote something on the page and did not add to it. Nora stood at the door for a moment. She said, "Did you know her well?" He said well enough. He said she used to come in on the first Tuesday of every month for 30 years, buy the same things: a box of number 8 wood screws, a tube of glazing compound, a pair of cottonwork gloves, size medium. He said she always paid in cash and always said thank you, and never once asked for anything to be put on account. He said the last time she came in was October of 2001, and she had been in her 80s by then, and she had bought the same things she always bought, and said thank you, and walked out to her truck, and he had watched her drive away up Route 7, and that had been the last time. He said the county had taken the property on a tax lien 2 years after that. He said he had thought about going out there a few times. He did not say why he had not. He went back to the ledger. Nora walked out to the truck and set the mortar bag and the lumber in the bed and laid the pry bar alongside the toolbox and stood for a moment with her hand on the truck door. The main street of Aldermore Hollow was quiet in the Tuesday morning way of small towns. A pickup pulling into the diner lot, a woman in a postal uniform loading a cart at the post office, a dog sitting on the sidewalk outside the barber shop with the patient, philosophical expression of a dog that has nowhere in particular to be. Nora pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her sternum, where the deed envelope had rested the day before. Then she got in the truck and drove back up Route 7 toward the schoolhouse, and the gravel came up under the tires at the 4-mile marker with the same steady crunch as before, and the sumac closed in from both sides. And somewhere ahead of her, Claire was pulling plaster from a wall in a building that had belonged, for 40 years, to a woman named Delia Marsh, who did things without making a point of doing them. The key turned up on the 9th day. Nora had been working the chimney joints on the south face, seated on a plank scaffold she and Claire had rigged between 2 stepladders, pressing Type S mortar into the open joints with a tuck pointer and wiping the excess with a damp sponge. The work required her to lean close to the masonry, and at that distance the brickwork showed itself in detail. The variation in the handmade brick, the slight irregularities of a wall built by someone working without a laser level, the ghost outlines of previous repointing jobs done in different decades with slightly different mortar mixes, each layer a different shade of gray. She was working the joint above the corbel where the chimney met the roof line when the tuck pointer caught on something, and she looked and saw the corner of a small envelope tucked into the joint, pushed back into the cavity behind the flashing. It was not mortar. It was paper, oilskin paper, folded twice around something small and hard. She came down from the scaffold and sat on the bottom rung and opened the oilskin fold on her knee. Inside was a key. Brass, old, the bow stamped with a simple diamond pattern that had worn nearly smooth. The blade cut for a warded lock of the type used in padlocks manufactured from roughly 1940 through 1970. The key was on a loop of copper wire twisted closed at the end. It was not labeled. It did not need to be. There was only one padlock on the property that mattered, and they had both been looking at it since the first afternoon. Nora set the key in her palm and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in the chest pocket of her flannel shirt and went back up the scaffold and finished the mortar joint she had been working on before she let herself think about what came next. She did not try the key that day. She was not sure why, exactly. The chimney work needed finishing before rain came in through the open joints, and the weather report on the hand-crank radio they had brought suggested Thursday. Claire did not ask about the key, though Nora had shown it to her at dinner. Claire had held it, turned it once, set it on the windowsill next to the grade book, and gone back to eating. That was Claire. She understood that some things moved at their own pace, and that pushing them did not make them move faster, only differently. The first evening Nora brought the key to the cellar door. She tried it in the dim light after supper on a Wednesday, and the key entered the lock but would not complete the turn. It caught at the 3/4 rotation, where the warded mechanism required a specific alignment she could not quite achieve with the lock seated in the hasp at its current angle. She did not force it. She backed the key out and went inside. The second evening, she brought a small bottle of penetrating oil from the toolbox and worked a few drops into the keyway and around the shackle, and let it sit for 20 minutes before she tried again. The key went further this time, to perhaps 7/8 of the turn, and then caught again. She backed it out and went inside and said nothing at dinner. The third evening was a Friday, 2 weeks and 3 days after they had first driven down the gravel lane. The light was going by 6 o'clock, the sky turning the deep blue-gray of early spring evenings in the hollow, where the ridge blocked the last of the sunset. Nora came to the cellar door with the key and the penetrating oil and the small flashlight, and she knelt on the damp ground beside the hasp and worked 2 more drops of oil into the keyway and waited. The wild grape tendrils along the door had begun to show the first swelling of new buds, small and tight and the color of dried blood. A wood thrush called once from the oak stand up the road. The ground under her knee was cold through her jeans. She put the key in the lock and turned it slowly, with steady pressure. Not forcing, just maintaining the torque, while she lifted the lock body slightly in the hasp to relieve the binding angle. The key moved. It completed the arc. There was a soft click, clean and final, and the shackle released and the padlock came open in her hand. She pulled the cellar doors open one at a time. The left door was heavier than it looked, the wood dense with age and moisture, and it came up with a low groan of the strap hinges and fell back against the foundation stone. The right door followed. Stone steps led down, 6 of them, cut from the same field stone as the foundation walls, worn slightly concave in the center from decades of use. The air that came up from below was cold and still, and carried the mineral smell of packed earth and old stone, and something faintly sweet that she could not immediately name. She clicked on the flashlight and went down. The cellar was a single room, roughly 16 feet by 12. With stone walls and a packed dirt floor, and a ceiling of rough-sawn boards that were the underside of the main room's subfloor above. The flashlight beam moved across wooden shelves built along the east and west walls, and on the shelves were mason jars, dozens of them, quart and pint sizes, their lids sealed with the 2-piece canning lids of the type that had been standard since the 1950s. The contents were still present in most of them, visible through the glass. Green beans gone a deep olive, tomatoes in their own liquid, what appeared to be apple butter, dark and dense. The seals looked intact. She did not open any of them. She moved the light slowly across the shelves and counted without meaning to. 41 jars on the east wall, perhaps 30 on the west. A winter's worth of work from a kitchen garden she could not now see but could imagine. The labor of a woman who had put things up against the cold for so many years that the motion had become as natural as breathing. In the far corner, behind the west shelf unit, the flashlight beam found something that did not belong to the same era as the mason jars. The shelf unit itself was built from 1x10 pine boards on simple cleats, but it was mounted on a piano hinge along its left edge. A full-length hinge, the kind used on heavy doors, set flush into the shelf frame. There was a small finger pull at the right edge of the unit, a brass cup pull, the kind set into a rooted recess so it lay flat with the face of the board. Nora stood very still for a moment. Then she set the flashlight on the shelf beside her, pointing at the corner, and reached out and hooked her finger into the cup pull and drew the shelf unit outward. It moved on the piano hinge with no resistance at all, as though it had been opened recently. Behind it, bolted to the foundation stone at 2 points with 1/4-inch lag bolts set in lead anchors, was a gray steel lockbox, 8 inches by 12 by 6, with a combination dial on the face and a secondary key lock below it. The combination dial was set to 0. She tried the key from the chimney flashing on the secondary lock, and it entered and turned. The box was not alarmed and not wired to anything. It simply opened. Inside, on a folded piece of chamois cloth, lay a bundle of currency banded with a paper strip in the hand she was beginning to recognize. $2,340 in mixed bills, the oldest of which was a 1985 Series 20. Beside the currency, a small canvas pouch drawn closed with a leather cord, heavy for its size, and when she loosened the cord and looked inside, she found silver coins, Morgan dollars and peace dollars, and a few Franklin half-dollars, perhaps 30 coins in all, their surfaces clouded with age, but their edges still crisp. And beneath the chamois cloth, at the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope. White, letter size, the flap secured with a length of clear tape that had yellowed at the edges. Written on the front in the same precise blue-black hand as the grade book, in letters that had not faded. To whoever needs this place most. Nora carried the envelope upstairs without opening it. She came up the cellar steps into the cooling evening air and crossed the yard to the schoolhouse and went inside. And Claire looked up from the section of south wall she had been patching with joint compound and saw Nora's face and set down the 6-inch knife without being asked. Nora set the envelope on the windowsill under the lantern. A battery camp lantern, the kind that throws a warm circle of light about 4 feet across. And then she went and got the 2 camp chairs from the corner and set them side by side facing the window, and they both sat down. The envelope lay between them on the sill. Neither of them reached for it for a full minute. Outside, the last light was gone from the ridge and the hollow had gone fully dark, and the birch saplings moved against the foundation in a sound that was, in the stillness of that room, the only sound there was. Claire picked up the envelope and looked at the front and then handed it to Nora. Nora worked the tape loose from the flap carefully, taking her time, not tearing it. The envelope contained 2 sheets of paper, folded in thirds, written on both sides in the same blue-black ink as the grade book and the envelope address. The same small, precise hand. The letters formed with the economy of someone who had spent 31 years writing on blackboards and in narrow gradebook columns. Nora unfolded the sheets and smoothed them against her knee and began to read aloud, slowly, the way you read something you want to get right the first time. The letter was dated September 3rd, 1991, and it began without salutation. I have thought about how to start this letter for a long time, and I have decided that a salutation is not the right way. I do not know who you are. That is the point. If I knew who you were, I would have found you already and given you what I am leaving here directly, which is what I would have preferred. Since I cannot know, I will write to the fact of you instead of the name of you, and trust that the fact is enough. My name is Delia Ruth Marsh. I was born in this county in 1916, and I have lived in it for all but 4 years of my life, which is the time I spent at the normal school in the capital getting my teaching certificate, and then 1 additional year teaching in a town 40 miles north before the position here came open. I came back in 1947. I taught in this building for 31 years. I bought the building and the land from the school district in 1979 for $4,200, which was more than I had, but less than it was worth. And the district accepted my offer because they wanted it to go to someone who would not tear it down, and they knew I would not tear it down. I have no children. I have no family remaining in this county or elsewhere that I am aware of. I had a brother who went to Korea and did not come back, and a mother who lived to 91, and a father who did not. I am telling you this not for sympathy, but for clarity. What I am leaving in this box, and in a second place I will describe shortly, has no other rightful claimant. It is yours, whoever you are, because you needed this place enough to find it. Nora paused. She turned the page. Claire sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the lantern and did not speak. The camp lantern hummed very faintly. Nora found her place and went on. I want to tell you something about this building before I tell you about the money. This schoolhouse taught children for 52 years, from 1921 when it was built to 1973, when the county consolidated the rural districts and the children began riding buses to the school in town. In that time it graduated, if you can use that word for a primary school, more than 400 children from this hollow and the surrounding farms. Some of them went on to the county high school, and some did not. Some of them I taught myself in my 31 years here, and some of them were taught by the two teachers who preceded me, Miss Arvella Cook, and before her a man named Harlan Pitt, whom I knew only from the grade books he left behind, which I kept in the cabinet below the south window. I do not know if those books are still there. I hope they are. They are a record of real children in a real place, and records like that deserve to be kept. I have spent the years since my retirement doing what I was always inclined to do and did not have enough time for during the school years, which is to pay attention to the people around me and help where helping was possible without making a production of it. I paid the back property taxes on the Geddes farm in '74, when Roy Geddes could not pay them and did not know where to turn. I paid them through the county office as an anonymous third party, which is a provision in county law that few people know exists. I did the same for the Tully family on County Road 412 in '78 and for the Marchetti family on Route 9 in '83. I left groceries on the Hendersons' porch on Birch Creek Road in the winter of '86 when Harold Henderson was in the hospital for 11 weeks and his wife was managing 4 children on what the farm brought in. I did not knock. I left the boxes before dawn and drove home in the dark. No one asked. No one needed to. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what I did with money during my life was not saving it. It was moving it. It passed through me from the place it accumulated to the place it was needed. And what is left in this box and in the second location is what was left over after a lifetime of that practice. It is not a fortune. It is a remainder. But a remainder is what you build from. And building is what this place was always for. Nora stopped again. She pressed the back of her wrist briefly against her mouth, and then lowered it and looked at the second sheet. Claire had not moved. Outside, a branch scraped once against the north window and was still. Nora drew a slow breath and finished the letter. The building needs work. I know this. I have done what I could maintain alone into my 70s, but there are things that require 2 people, and I have been one person for a long time. The roof wants a rafter on the south side. The east joist at the bearing wall is soft. The chimney damper is seized and will need freeing or replacing. These are not small tasks, but they are not beyond a person willing to learn them, and the fact that you are here suggests you are willing. There is a second location in this cellar that I have not described yet. I will describe it in a second letter, which I will leave there. I have done it this way deliberately. I wanted the first letter to be about the building and about the work, before it is about anything else, because I believe that is the right order. You should know what you are taking on before you know what you are receiving. That has always seemed to me the honest way. One last thing. If you are alone in this, I am sorry for that, and I hope you will not always be. If you are not alone, hold on to whoever is with you. This county can be hard, and the hollow can be isolating, and the winters here are longer than people expect. But the building is sound where it counts. The bones are good. I built my life in it, and I am content to leave it in your hands. I hope you will be warm here. I hope you will be fed. I hope that when someone comes to your door with nothing, you will find that you have something to give them. With regard, Delia Ruth Marsh. September 3rd, 1991. Nora set the letter down on the windowsill. She set it carefully, smoothing the fold, aligning the edge with the sill's edge. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Claire reached over and picked up the letter and read the last half-page herself in silence, her lips moving slightly on certain lines. Then she folded it along the original creases and set it back on the sill between them. The lantern hummed. The birch saplings moved. Neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind that comes after something has been received and has not yet been fully taken in, the kind that deserves to be left alone. 3 weeks after the cellar door opened, the schoolhouse had begun to look like a place where work was being done rather than a place where work was needed. The failed rafter on the south side had been sistered with a length of 2 by 6, the new lumber pale against the dark of the original framing, the connection made with a double row of 3-inch structural screws and a rafter tie at the ridge. The east joist had been sistered as well, pressure-treated stock bolted through with half-inch carriage bolts to the original 2 by 8, the bearing end sitting now on a new pressure-treated sill plate, shimmed level, with cedar shims. The south wall plaster was gone, replaced with half-inch drywall taped and mudded to the second coat. The chimney joints were repointed. The porch step had new treads cut from 2 by 10 pine, the cut ends sealed with exterior primer before installation. None of it was finished. All of it was moving in a direction. The man arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of May, when the sumac along the lane had leafed out fully and the birch saplings at the foundation were carrying their first full canopy of the season. So the schoolhouse sat in a kind of green enclosure that softened its lines and made it look, from the road, almost deliberate. He drove a white crew cab pickup, newer, with a magnetic sign on the door that read, Fells Property Group, in a clean serif font. He parked on the gravel apron beside the Ranger and got out with a clipboard under his arm and a travel mug in his hand, and stood for a moment looking at the building with the practiced, assessing look of someone who has looked at a great many buildings and learned to keep his face neutral while doing it. He was perhaps 50, trim, in a pressed Oxford shirt and khaki trousers, and boots that were new enough that they had not yet creased at the ankle. His name was Warren Fells. Nora was on the porch when he arrived, sanding the new treads with a random orbit sander, the extension cord running back through the front door to the outlet she and Claire had wired the previous week. A new GFCI outlet on a circuit they had run from the temporary service panel the utility company had connected at the meter base. She heard the truck on the gravel and looked up and turned off the sander and set it down. She did not stand. She waited. Warren Fells came across the gravel and stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at the new treads and then at her, and said good morning with a pleasantness that was genuine enough on the surface and precise enough underneath that it was hard to say where one ended and the other began. She said good morning. He told her his name and the name of his company, and said he understood the property had changed hands at the spring tax auction, and that he hoped she did not mind him stopping by. He said it the way people say things they do not actually expect you to mind. She said she did not mind, and he came up the new steps, and she stood then. Because standing seemed like the right response to the clipboard, he looked at the porch boards, the new treads, the sanded surface, and nodded once in the way of a man noting a data point. He asked if she was the owner. She said she was one of them. He said that was fine. He was happy to talk to whoever was available. His tone was warm and even, and carried the low, steady confidence of someone accustomed to being received. He told her his company acquired and developed rural properties in the county and 3 adjacent counties, primarily agricultural and light commercial parcels, and that they had had an interest in this particular property for some time and had been disappointed when it did not come to them through the previous tax cycle. He said he was not here to cause any difficulty, and he understood she had just acquired the place and had clearly begun some improvements. He glanced again at the porch treads. He said he wanted to make a simple offer, out of respect for her time and his own, and that she was under no obligation to receive it. She said she was listening. $18,000, he said, as is no inspection contingency. Closing costs covered by the buyer, 30-day close. He said it simply, without staging it, the way you say a number you have thought about and settled on. He said he understood the property carried a deferred maintenance burden, and that bringing it to a habitable standard, if that was her intention, would require a capital outlay that might exceed what the property could support in its current zoning classification. He said the word zoning carefully, not as a threat, just as a word that meant something. He said there were questions about the permitted status of recent electrical work and about the building's classification under the current county code for rural non-agricultural structures, and that navigating those questions could be time-consuming and costly for someone without experience in county permitting. He said all of this in the same even tone he had used to say good morning. Nora listened. She had her hands in the front pocket of her canvas work apron, and she stood with her weight on both feet and her face level, and she listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said she appreciated him coming out. He nodded. She said she would need to talk to her sister. He said of course there was no rush. This was an open offer, and he was not the kind to put a clock on things. He reached into the chest pocket of his Oxford shirt and produced a business card. Cream stock, the same serif font as the truck door, and held it out, and she took it. He said he would check back in a week or two if he had not heard from her. He said the number on the card reached him directly. She said she understood. He went back down the new steps and across the gravel to the white truck, and she watched him go. He did not look back at the building the way most people looked back at it. He looked at the gravel lane, measuring something about the access. And then he got in the truck and backed out carefully and drove down through the sumac toward Route 7, and the sound of the engine faded and the hollow went quiet again. Claire appeared in the doorway behind Nora. She had been inside, finishing the third coat of drywall mud on the south wall, and she had a 6-inch taping knife in one hand and a smear of joint compound on her forearm. She had heard enough. Nora held the card between 2 fingers and looked at it. Warren Fells, Principal. Fells Property Group, LLC. A phone number and a post office box in the county seat. She turned the card over. The back was blank. She thought about what he had said about zoning and about permitted electrical work, and she knew enough to know that he was not wrong about the complexity of it. She had read the county code document she had downloaded from the county website on the library computer in town, and the classification question for a rural non-agricultural structure that had once been a public school building and was now in private hands was genuinely unclear and would require at minimum a meeting with the county planning office and possibly a variance application. She knew this. It did not change anything. It was just the shape of the work. She set the card on the windowsill inside the door, on top of Delia's letter, which she and Claire had read a second time together, 2 nights after the first reading, and had not moved since. She picked up the random orbit sander and plugged it back in and knelt on the porch boards and went back to the treads. The sander's motor rose to its working pitch, the pale wood surface smoothed under the pad in slow overlapping passes. The morning was warm now, the sun up over the east ridge, and the light came through the birch canopy in shifting pieces and lay on the porch boards in patterns that moved as the leaves moved. Nora worked her way down the tread from left to right, overlapping each pass by half. The way you do it when you want an even result and you are willing to take the time. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The sander said enough. The second lockbox announced itself on a Saturday morning, 10 days after Warren Fells had left his card on the windowsill. Claire found it. She had gone back to the cellar to bring up 2-quart jars of the tomatoes from the east shelf. They had opened one the previous week on a cautious experiment and found the seal intact and the contents sound, the tomatoes still firm in their own liquid, the smell clean and acidic and right, and they had eaten them heated in a pan on the camp stove over pasta, and neither of them had gotten sick, which settled the question of the rest of the jars. Claire was lifting the second jar from the shelf when she noticed that the packed dirt floor in the corner behind the false shelf unit was not entirely uniform. The unit itself was still swung open on its piano hinge from the last time Nora had been in to retrieve the first lockbox in the letter. Claire crouched with the lantern and looked at the floor in the corner and saw the outline. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a rectangle in the dirt that was slightly more compressed than the surrounding floor. The kind of difference that only shows under low raking light and only to someone who is already looking carefully at the ground. She set the mason jars on the bottom shelf and went up to the main room and got the short pry bar from the toolbox without explaining herself. Nora watched her go back down the cellar steps and followed. Claire was already on her knees in the corner, working the flat end of the pry bar along the edge of the rectangle she had found, and when the tip caught on something, a seam, a frame edge, and the section of floor moved slightly, they both went still for a moment. The rectangle was a fitted panel of 1-inch pine, cut flush to the surrounding dirt and tamped down so the surface matched. The edges beveled slightly, so the bar could find purchase, but the panel would not shift on its own. Claire worked the bar along the full perimeter, and then levered the panel up from one corner, and it came free with the soft resistance of something that has been seated a long time and is not accustomed to being asked to move. Below the panel was a cavity in the earth, roughly the size of a large suitcase, framed with pressure-treated 2x6s set on edge and a poured concrete base. It had been built with some care. The framing was level, the concrete base smooth, and a length of rubber membrane had been laid over the concrete and run up the inside faces of the framing to keep the moisture out. On the rubber membrane, occupying most of the cavity floor, sat a gray steel lockbox. Smaller than the first in its footprint, but considerably thicker. 8 inches by 10 but 4 inches deep rather than 2. And heavier when Nora lifted it, heavier than the first by perhaps 5 pounds, which was not an inconsiderable difference for a box that size. The combination dial was set to 0, same as the first. The secondary key lock below it accepted the same brass key from the chimney flashing. The shackle released with the same soft click, and Nora opened the lid. On top, folded in the same oilskin paper as the first letter, was a second envelope. Nora set it aside. Below the envelope lay a stack of documents in a clear plastic sleeve, sealed at the top with electrical tape that had gone brittle with age. Through the plastic she could see the face of the top document, a bond certificate, the kind issued by county municipalities for infrastructure projects. The denomination printed in the corner in figures that she had to look at twice to be sure she was reading correctly. She set the sleeve on the floor beside her knee and looked at Nora, and Nora looked back at her. Below the bond sleeve was a small bank passbook, the kind issued by savings institutions, before everything moved to statements mailed in envelopes, and then to statements not mailed at all. The passbook was for an account at First Aldermore Savings and Loan. The last entry was dated March 14, 2001, and showed a balance of $61,400. Nora sat back on her heels. The lantern sat between them on the dirt floor and threw its warm circle of light across the open box and the documents, and the two of them. And outside the cellar, the May morning was going on without them. The birch canopy moving in the light wind, a pair of barn swallows that had taken up residence in the gap under the east eave calling to each other in their dry, ticking voices. And none of that reached them down here. Nora picked up the second envelope and opened it the way she had opened the first, carefully, without tearing. She unfolded 2 sheets of the same paper in the same hand, dated October 9, 1998, 7 years after the first letter, and began to read. The letter described the bond certificates, county general obligation bonds from 2 separate issuances, 1981 and 1989. purchased at face value and held, now matured and redeemable at any county-affiliated financial institution. It described the savings account and gave the account number and noted that Delia had continued making deposits as recently as 2001, and that the account had been structured as a payable-on-death account with the beneficiary listed as the legal owner of the Route 7 property at the time of claim. She had arranged this with the savings and loan in 2001, the last year she had been well enough to drive to town on a regular basis. She had not told anyone she had done it. The letter said, "I mention this not to impress you with my planning, but to spare you confusion at the bank. Bring the deed. They will know what to do." They brought the deed and the passbook and the bond certificates to First Aldermore Savings and Loan on a Tuesday morning 11 days later, after Claire had called ahead and spoken to the branch manager, a woman named Patricia Odom, who had gone quiet on the phone for a moment when Claire gave the account number and then said she would need to see some documentation and that they should come in at 9. Patricia Odom was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in her movements, and when she looked at the deed and the passbook and the bond certificates, she set them on the desk in a careful row and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then she said she had grown up in Aldermore Hollow. She said her father's name had been Ray Odom and that he had farmed on County Road 412. She said that in the winter of 1978, when she was in the 2nd grade, someone had paid the back taxes on her family's farm anonymously through the county office, and her father had never found out who. He had spent years trying to find out. He had never managed it. She said this to the desk, not to them. And then she squared the documents in their row and looked up and said she would get the paperwork started. Earl Braddock came to the schoolhouse that same week, on a Thursday afternoon, uninvited, in his own truck, with a length of 6-inch crown molding in the bed that he said he had milled from white oak salvage and thought might suit the main room if they wanted it. He did not ask if they wanted help installing it. He brought a finish nailer and a compressor and a miter box and spent 4 hours cutting and fitting and nailing the molding to the junction of wall and ceiling, while Nora worked on the window glazing and Claire painted the north wall its first coat of interior latex. He did not talk much. When he was done, he packed his tools and looked at the room and said it was coming along. Nora said it was. He nodded and picked up the compressor and went out to his truck, and she heard the truck start and pull down the gravel lane, and the sound of it faded into the hollow. The molding ran the full perimeter of the room in clean mitered corners, the white oak pale and fine-grained against the new paint, and it looked like something that had always been there and always would be. Warren Fells came back on the following Monday, as he had said he would. He parked on the gravel apron and came to the porch and knocked. Nora opened the door. He looked at the room behind her, the painted walls, the molding, the refinished floor she and Claire had begun on the previous weekend, the new GFCI outlets on their cover plates, the light fixture they had hung from the original ceiling box, a simple porcelain dome in white that cast the room in clean, even light. He took it in without commenting. Then he looked at her and said he hoped his offer was still being considered. She said it was not. He was quiet for a moment. He said he understood and that he wished them well with the project. He said the building had good bones. She said she knew. He went back down the steps and across the gravel and did not look back at the building, and the white truck went down the lane through the green tunnel of sumac and birch, and Route 7 swallowed it and it was gone. 6 months is not a long time to restore a building. It is long enough to learn one. By the 2nd week of October, the schoolhouse on Route 7 had a new cedar roof, the ridge straight now, and the sag gone, the shingles laid in even courses that would weather to silver inside of 3 years and then hold for 30. The chimney drew cleanly. A sweep had come out from town in August and cleared the flue and reset the damper and pronounced the liner sound, which had been the best possible news on the worst possible question. The porch was solid end to end, new treads and a new middle stringer on the left side where the old one had rotted through. the whole assembly primed and painted in the same cream that the rest of the exterior wore now, 2 coats of oil-based applied on consecutive dry September days. The 2 boarded windows had glass again, single over single replacements that did not match the original 6 over 6 exactly, but sat in the restored frames without gaps. And in the morning light they caught the ridge line to the east and held it briefly, luminous, before the angle changed and the light moved on. The main room had become, over those months, the thing Nora had seen in her head on the first night they slept there in their sleeping bags, though she would not have said so aloud. The wide plank pine floor had been belt-sanded and hand-scraped and finished with 3 coats of oil-modified polyurethane in a satin sheen, the grain of the old wood emerging through the finish in long, warm lines the color of buckwheat honey. The walls were painted a warm white with a slight gray undertone that shifted in different lights, cooler in the morning, warmer in the afternoon when the south windows caught the low October sun. Earl's white oak crown molding ran the perimeter in clean, tight corners. The Comfort King furnace was gone, hauled to the salvage yard in town in late June for $43, replaced by a propane wall unit with a thermostat that Claire had installed on a Saturday afternoon, with a manual from the manufacturer and a single phone call to the propane company to confirm the line pressure. The chimney firebox had been cleaned and fitted with a cast iron insert, a used Jotl model, bought from a farm estate sale for $211, transported in the truck bed on moving blankets. And it drew well and heated the room on its own when the nights turned cold. They had moved in properly in August, once the roof was sealed and the electrical was inspected. The county building inspector, a man named Dale Pruitt, who had been doing the job for 22 years and had the undramatic thoroughness of someone who has seen every possible way a building can fail, had walked through the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in late July with his clipboard and his moisture meter and his flashlight and had found 3 items requiring correction, all of them minor, and had returned 2 weeks later and found them corrected, and had signed the inspection card without ceremony and handed it to Nora and said the place cleaned up nicely. She had thanked him. He had looked once more at the white oak molding and the finished floor and said whoever did the floor work knew what they were doing. She said it was her and her sister. He nodded and went out to his truck. The zoning question had resolved itself in September with the help of Patricia Odom, who had known without being asked that the right person to talk to at the county planning office was a senior clerk named George Huff, who had been administering rural non-agricultural variance applications for 16 years and who understood, when Patricia explained the history of the building and the nature of the intended use, that a structure of this type and this history deserved a reasonable path rather than a categorical obstruction. The intended use was what they had arrived at over the course of the summer, in the practical way that purpose sometimes reveals itself through use. A community workspace during the day, available to anyone in the hollow and the surrounding roads who needed a table and a warm room, and an outlet for a laptop or a sewing machine or a lamp. And on certain nights, a place where someone with nowhere else could sleep on one of the 2 camp cots they had set up in the anteroom, off the main space. Not a shelter in any formal sense, just a building with an unlocked door and people inside who would make coffee if you needed it. The first person to use the anteroom cots had been a man named Curtis Vey, 61, who had been evicted from his rental in the county seat in August and was working day labor through a farm contractor and had nowhere to put himself between the end of the workday and the beginning of the next one. He had come up Route 7 on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of August on the recommendation of Earl Braddock, who had told him only that there were 2 women with a schoolhouse who would not turn him away. Curtis Vey had a duffel bag and a pair of work boots tied together by the laces and $9 in his shirt pocket. He stood at the door and said he had heard there might be a place to sleep. Claire had opened the door wide and said there was, and had put the camp stove on for coffee while Nora showed him the anteroom. He had stayed 4 nights and had left on a Sunday morning, after helping Nora carry a section of new gutter from the truck to the ladder, which she had not asked him to do, and which he had not explained. He had said thank you at the door, and she had said come back if you need to, and he had nodded and gone down the steps and turned up the lane toward Route 7, with his duffel over one shoulder and his boots in his hand. By October, they had a wood stove in the anteroom and a proper cot frame with a mattress bought second-hand in town, and a wool blanket from the general goods store on the main street of Aldermore Hollow, where a woman named June Casper had sold it to them for $14 and had asked what it was for. Claire had told her, in the straightforward way Claire had of telling people things. And June Casper had said she had gone to school in this very building, that she had been in the last class before the district closed it in 1973, that her teacher had been Delia Marsh. She had stood behind the counter for a moment, looking at the wool blanket, and then she had taken it back and folded it differently, tighter, and wrapped it in brown paper, and taped the paper closed and handed it back. She had not charged them the $14. Claire had set the money on the counter anyway, and June Casper had looked at it and left it there, and said to tell her if they needed anything else. The evening the cycle closed was a Friday in the second week of October, the kind of October evening in the Hollow when the temperature drops 20 degrees between 4 o'clock and 6, and the sky goes from pale blue to deep, and the first hard smell of wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge comes down through the trees and settles around the building like a hand. Nora was at the table in the main room going through the county variance paperwork with a pen, marking the lines that still needed signatures. And Claire was at the kitchen end. They had built a small kitchen in the former coat closet alcove off the main room over the summer, a countertop and a single basin sink and a 2-burner propane cooktop and 8 linear feet of open shelving. Stirring a pot of vegetable soup that had been on the low burner since 2 o'clock, and had reached the state of deep reduction, where a wooden spoon drawn through it left a trail that closed slowly. The jottle insert was running at low draft, its glass front showing the orange pulse of the fire inside. The room smelled of soup and wood smoke and the linseed oil undertone of the finished floor. The knock at the door was soft, not tentative exactly, but careful. The knock of someone who is not certain of their reception and is trying to ask rather than demand. Nora set down the pen and went to the door and opened it. On the porch stood a young woman, perhaps 20, in a canvas jacket too light for the evening, with a duffel bag over one shoulder, a dark green bag with a broken zipper held shut with a safety pin. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been moving for a long time and has learned to conserve what they have. She said she had come up Route 7 and seen the light, and she was wondering if there was somewhere she could sit for a little while. She said she had $9. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the door wide and said, "Come in." The young woman came inside and stood on the finished pine floor and looked at the room. The warm light, the molding, the fire behind the jottle glass, the table with its papers, the smell of the soup coming from the alcove. And her face did the thing that faces do when a person has been cold for a long time and warmth arrives without condition. Claire set an extra bowl on the counter without being asked. Nora pulled a chair from the table and set it near the insert where the heat came off strongest. The fire in the jottle ticked softly in the way of cast iron finding its working temperature. Outside, the dark had come fully down over Aldermore Hollow, and the schoolhouse windows threw their light out into it, warm and plain and steady against the early dark. Some things do not need to be explained, they simply need to be left on, like a light in a window, for whoever is still out on the road.